I'm Frances Holloway, 57, and I rose from a young lieutenant standing a post to a 3-star general responsible for every gate in the Army. For 35 years, I carried one lesson my father gave me, that the person wearing the badge has to be the most careful one in the room. But when a frightened young soldier drove me to the concrete at a checkpoint I was responsible for, and held me there with no idea who I was, I had to make a choice that could have ended his career or changed everything. Have you ever been underestimated or mistreated by someone who had no idea who you really were? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stay calm when everything in you wanted to fight back, hit that like button and subscribe. My father wore a badge for 30 years and never once raised his voice while he had it on. He told me the reason when I was 9, standing at our kitchen table while he buttoned the collar of his police uniform before a night shift. He said the badge only works if the person wearing it is more careful than the people they stop. He said it the way other fathers said grace, like it was the thing that held the meal together. Then he kissed the top of my head and went out into the dark to spend 8 hours being more careful than everyone he met. Before the police, he had been an Army military policeman. He did not talk about that part much, but it lived in the way he stood and the way he watched a room, and it lived in that one sentence about the badge, which he had learned in a uniform before he ever pinned it to a town. I grew up thinking that was what authority was, not the power to make people do things, the obligation to be the calmest person in every situation that could tip. My sister Colette is 3 years older than me, and she learned a different lesson from the same house. She learned that our father's stillness was a wall you could not get behind. Where I saw discipline, she saw distance. Where I heard care, she heard a man managing his own heart like a shift schedule. Colette was warm the way a kitchen is warm. She stayed in our town, she knew everyone's business and their birthdays, and she loved out loud. And from the time we were teenagers, she had a theory about me that she has never fully let go of. She used to say that I only felt things in the right order, that I would file an emotion where it belonged and never let it out of the drawer. When I told my family I was going to the military academy, my father drove 8 hours to pin my bars the day I was commissioned, in the summer of 1991. He stood in the crowd in a coat that did not quite fit anymore, and when he set those gold bars on my shoulders, his hands were steadier than mine. Colette did not come. She had a reason, a good enough reason, a job she could not leave. But we both knew the reason, underneath the reason. On the phone that night, I said, "You could have been there." And she said, "You never needed anyone in the room, Frances. That is the whole problem with you." I was 22 years old, and I did not have an answer for her. I am 57 now. I wear 3 stars on each shoulder, and until a few weeks ago, I still did not have an answer for her. What I had instead was 35 years of being told by the person who had known me longest that the uniform had made me cold. You can carry a thing like that a long way. You can carry it up every rank there is. It does not get lighter, you just get stronger around it. I chose the military police because of my father, though I never told him that in those words. I wanted the part of soldiering that was about protecting people from the worst moment of their day, including protecting them from the person holding the authority. I liked gates and posts and the quiet arithmetic of who gets to pass and why. Most people think a checkpoint is about keeping people out. My father taught me it is really about the promise you make to everyone you let in, that the person standing between them and their family is steady and trained and more careful than they need to be. I believe that at 22, standing at my first post with my heart going too fast, I believe it now with more rank than my father could have imagined for me. What happened in between is a career, and most of a career is unremarkable, the slow accumulation of days where nothing tips. But there were a handful of days that made me, and they are the reason I did what I did on the concrete at Fort Calvert. To understand why a 3-star general let a frightened young man put his knee in her back and did not so much as raise her voice, you have to know the days that taught me what a scared person at a gate is capable of, and what it costs to be the one who stays calm, because I have been the scared one, and I have been the calm one, and I have spent my whole life trying to make sure the soldiers under me learn the difference before the difference costs somebody everything. That is the work, not the stars. The stars are just what they give you when you have done enough of the work that they trust you to be careful on a bigger and bigger scale. My father would have understood that. Colette never has. And for most of my life, those 2 facts have sat in me like 2 stones, one on each side, keeping me upright and keeping me from ever setting either of them down. This is the story of the day they finally moved. It started, the way most of the important days of my life have started, with me walking up to a gate. The last thing my father said to me that meant anything, he said years before he died, and it was not dramatic. We were sitting on his porch, and I was a major by then, home for a few days between assignments. He asked me if I still remembered the thing about the badge. I said, of course. He nodded and looked out at the road and said, "The hardest part isn't the stopping. Anybody can stop somebody. The hardest part is the not stopping. Knowing when to let your hands stay where they are. That is the whole job, Franny, and most people never learn it because nobody ever makes them practice being still." I did not know it then, but he had just handed me the exact sentence I would need on the worst and best morning of my career. He had spent his whole life practicing being still, in 2 uniforms, on 1,000 nights when it would have been easier to be loud. And he had raised a daughter who would one day get the chance to prove, on a piece of concrete, in front of witnesses, that the stillness had gone all the way down. I only wish he had lived to see it. Colette, at least, was still alive to hear about it. That turned out to matter more than I could have known. There is a version of me that never had to find out how deep the stillness went. That version is the one Colette believes in, the cold one, the one who feels things in the right order and never out of turn. I have spent a long time being angry that she could not see the other version. What I had not understood, until a specialist half my age drove my cheek into the ground, was that I had never given her a reason to. I had told her I was careful. I had never shown her. Some things you cannot argue. You can only demonstrate. And the universe, in its strange mercy, hands you the chance to demonstrate them at the exact moment you would least have chosen. The chance, when it came, was wearing a military police brassard, and it was terrified, and it did not know who I was, and that was the whole point. I had made share of it. By 2005, I was a major, 36 years old, and I had learned what a control point feels like when it is about to come apart. We were running a checkpoint outside a city whose name does not matter to this story, in the kind of heat that makes everyone's judgment worse. There was a crowd, and there was a young soldier of mine, a private first class, close enough to panic that I could see it in his shoulders before I could see it in his face. His weapon was coming up. Not because anyone had threatened him, because his fear had run out ahead of his training, and his hands had started to do the thinking, which is the most dangerous thing that can happen to a person with a rifle and a mandate. I put my hand on his forearm. I did not grab it. I set it there, the way my father set his hand on things, and I said his name, and I said, "Breathe, and then decide. Breathe, and then decide." I said it 3 times before his shoulders came down. The crowd was not the threat. The crowd was 100 people who wanted to get home to their families, and one frightened American boy with a gun was the only thing standing between them and the worst headline of the week. I talked him down. And 30 seconds later, an improvised explosive changed the shape of the afternoon, and I woke up somewhere else with shrapnel in my leg and a ringing in my ears that took a month to fade. They gave me a bronze star with a V for the crowd and a purple heart for the leg, and I have never worn either one without thinking about that boy's shoulders. Because here is the thing nobody puts in the citation. I had been him. 10 years before, at my own first post, I had felt my own fear run out ahead of me. Felt my hands start to want the decision, and the only reason I did not do something I could not undo was that a sergeant standing next to me said, "Easy, Lieutenant." Just like that. Easy. One word from a calm person is sometimes the whole difference between a story that ends and a story that never should have happened. That is the day I stopped believing that the person holding the authority is automatically the safe one in the room. Very often, the person holding the authority is the most frightened person in the room. And their fear is the most dangerous fear there is because it comes with permission. The badge that my father loved so much is also a loaded thing. It hands a scared human being the right to act on their fear and call it duty. My whole career after that leg wound was, in one way or another, about training the fear out of young soldiers before their hands learned to think for them. About making them practice being still. The person who helped me do that work, more than anyone, was Naomi Marsh. I met her in the late 1990s on a peacekeeping deployment in the Balkans, when she was a sergeant and I was a captain, and I knew within a week that she was the rarest thing in any organization. A person who will tell you the truth to your face and let the truth do the work instead of her ego. We came up together for the better part of 30 years. She is a command sergeant major now, which is the highest an enlisted soldier goes, and she has stood at my shoulder through every command I have held. She is the one person alive who is not impressed by my stars, and I need her for exactly that reason. A general surrounded only by people who agree with her is a general who's about to make a mistake. I remember the exact night I decided I would keep Naomi Marsh in my life for as long as she would let me. We were in a cold building in the Balkans with the power out, running a holding area for people who had done nothing worse than be caught on the wrong road after dark, and a young soldier under us wanted to lock the whole lot of them down hard because that felt safer to him and because fear always votes for the tighter grip. Naomi, a sergeant then, stepped in front of him without raising her voice and said, "These are somebody's parents and they are going home to somebody's kids, and you are going to treat them like it, because the day you stop is the day you turn into the thing we came here to stop." He backed off. I was a captain and I was supposed to be the one saying that, and a sergeant had said it better than I could have. I learned 2 things that night. I learned what right looked like when it had no rank behind it, only conviction. And I learned that I would be a better officer for the rest of my career if I stayed close to the people who would say the true thing, whether or not I outranked them. Naomi has been saying the true thing to me for almost 30 years now. She has been wrong about small things and never once about a large one. My father died in 2019. I was a brigadier general by then, 1 star, and I was half a world away when the call came, and by the time I reached the hospital, he was already gone and Colette was already there. She had been there for days. She had been there for the whole slow ending while I was managing a schedule of things that had felt urgent and now felt like nothing. I walked into that room and my sister looked at me with a grief so old and so specific that it had my name on it. "He waited for you," she said. "Not cruel. Worse than cruel. True. He always waited for you, Francis." I did not defend myself. There was nothing to defend. I had been careful with 10,000 strangers, and I had not been in the room for the one man who taught me how. That is the arithmetic Colette has always held against me. And the terrible thing is that on that day, she was right, and we both knew it, and the wall between us got another course of bricks laid on top. I flew back to my command 2 days after the funeral. I told myself that was duty. I have had a long time to wonder how much of it was that I could not stand in that town, in his absence, being seen by my sister as the daughter who was never there. 5 years later, they gave me my 3rd star and a job that would have made my father laugh out loud with pride. They made me the incoming commander of the headquarters that runs every army installation there is. Every garrison, every gate, every access control point on every post in the force. Naomi found out and grinned at me and said, "Let me get this straight. They are putting you in charge of 10,000 front doors." And I said yes, and she said, "Franny, that is either the funniest thing I have ever heard or the most dangerous, and I still cannot tell which." She was not wrong on either count. A general who commands the gates has a protective detail. It is not vanity. At a certain level, you become a target and a liability, and the Army assigns criminal investigation division agents to keep you from becoming a headline. Mine was led by a special agent named Dominic Cross. 40 years old, quiet, competent, the kind of man who notices the exits without seeming to look at them. He and 2 other agents traveled with me. I mention them now because they are about to matter, and because on the morning this story turns, I did something with them that a lot of generals would never do. I told them to hang back. I told them to let me walk up to the gate alone, like a stranger, like a visitor, like anyone. I wanted to see my own system the way the most powerless person who uses it sees it. I did not know that decision was about to hand me the chance I had waited 35 years for. I only knew that you cannot inspect a front door from inside the house. Fort Calvert sits at the end of a long approach road, and I had it put on my schedule as a no-notice look, which means nobody on the post knew the incoming 3-star was coming a day early to test their access control from the outside in. I was in civilian clothes, slacks, and a plain jacket, a soft bag over my shoulder with my identification in it. Cross was unhappy about the plan and said so, professionally once, and then did his job, which was to park the vehicle a few dozen feet back and let his agents drift out behind me on foot, close enough to close the distance in seconds, far enough that I read, to anyone at the gate, as a woman walking up alone. It was early. The light was still coming up, gray and flat, the way it does before a summer day decides to be hot. There was one young soldier working the pedestrian access point, and even from a distance I could see something in his posture that I recognized, the way I had recognized it in that private's shoulders in 2005. Wound tight, overcorrecting, a person doing a job while afraid of the job. I did not know his name yet. His name was Specialist Wesley Pratt. He was 24 years old, and a week earlier he had been reprimanded for letting a vehicle through his gate without a proper check. He had spent 7 days being told in the 1,000 ways an organization tells you that he had failed. And now, here came a stranger, walking up out of the gray, and he was determined not to fail again. I have thought a great deal since about how much of what happened next was already loaded into him before I ever said a word. He was a bowstring. I just happened to be the hand that brushed him. He told me to stop. His voice was too loud for the distance between us, which is the first tell of a frightened person with authority. I stopped. I stood still, and I kept my hands where he could see them, because I have trained 10,000 soldiers on what a non-threatening posture looks like from the other side, and I know how to be the calmest body in a frame. He said, "Identification." I said, "Yes, it is in my bag. I am going to reach for it slowly." And I did exactly that. I moved my hand toward the soft bag on my shoulder at the speed you would move it if you were narrating every inch, which I was. It was not slow enough, or rather it was plenty slow, and it did not matter because he was not watching my hand. He was watching his own fear. "Hands!" he shouted. "Hands! Get down! Get down on the ground!" And there it was, the fear running out ahead of the training, the hands starting to think. I had seen it 100 times. I had never once seen it aimed at me. Here is where 35 years lives or dies. Every instinct I owned said, "Stand up," said, "Announce yourself," said, "Specialist, I am a lieutenant general, and you will come to attention." I had the rank, I had the right, I had the absolute certainty that one sentence from me would freeze him solid. And I did not say it, because I know something about a scared man with permission that most people learn too late. If I made him more afraid, I did not know what his hands would do. He had a weapon, he had a mandate, he had a week of being told he was a failure. And the one thing I was not going to do, the one thing my father spent his whole life practicing and my whole career trying to teach, was become the second person at that gate to let my fear make my decisions. So I got down. A 3-star general lowered herself onto the concrete she was responsible for, in front of her own protective detail, and let a specialist half her age take control of her body. Every instinct I had said, "Stand up." 35 years of instinct, and I let the concrete take my cheek instead, because a scared man with authority is the most dangerous thing at any gate, and I was not going to make him more scared. My father's voice was in my head, clear as the porch and the road. The hardest part is the not stopping. Knowing when to let your hands stay where they are. His knee came into my back, not a strike. He knelt on me, the way the checklist somewhere in his training had told him to control a non-compliant subject, and he put his weight there and he held me down and he said, "Stay down, lady. Stay down." His voice was shaking. He was not cruel. I want that understood, because it would be a simpler story if he had been cruel, and it would be a less true one. He was terrified, and he was overcommitted, and he had crossed a line he did not know how to uncross, and that is worse than cruelty, because cruelty at least knows what it is doing. My cheek was on the ground, and I could see, sideways, the ordinary morning going on, and I breathed, and I did not fight, and I waited, because I knew what was standing a few feet behind me. They did not run. That is the thing I will always be proud of, about Cross and his agents. A lesser detail would have come in hot and turned a bad moment into a catastrophe, and then the story would have been about 2 frightened groups of armed people colliding, and somebody would have gotten hurt. Instead, they closed in, the way you close a door, steadily, deliberately, 3 men in plain clothes and sunglasses, stepping out of the gray and forming a calm ring around a single specialist. Hands visible, nothing drawn, no shouting. They boxed him in with their bodies and their stillness. And Cross, in front, held up a badge at Pratt's eye level and said 4 words in a voice with no heat in it at all. "Specialist. Step off the general. Now," he added. Just that. Now. I felt the weight come off my back all at once, the way weight comes off when a body stops trusting itself. I turned my head enough to see Wesley Pratt's face, and I watched the color leave it. I watched him look down at the woman he had put on the ground and do the arithmetic of the word Cross had used, general. And I watched 24 years of a life arrive at a single instant and understand that everything had just changed. He went white. His mouth opened and nothing came out. And I lay there one more second on the concrete of my own installation, a 3-star general who had refused to be the second person at that gate to lose her composure. And I thought, with a clarity that surprised me, my father would have known exactly why I stayed down. Now I just have to make sure this boy lives long enough to learn it too. Colonel Everett Shaw ran. I heard him before I saw him, boots hitting the pavement at a dead sprint, and by the time I had gotten my hands under me, he was there. The garrison commander of Fort Calvert, 50 years old and going gray at the temples, and he had already understood the size of the disaster that had just happened on his gate. Cross had a hand under my elbow, not lifting me, just there, and I came up to my feet on my own, which mattered to me, and I brushed the grit off my cheek with the back of my hand. Shaw's face was a study in a very specific kind of horror, the horror of a commander who has just watched his career and his conscience collide at the same intersection. "Ma'am," he said. "Ma'am, I am so sorry. We did not know you were. I will have his rank by tonight. I will have him out of that uniform by the end of the week." He was already reaching for the young man, already turning the incident into a punishment, because that is what the machine does. It finds the failure point and it removes it, and it tells itself the system is healthy again. And I looked at Wesley Pratt. He was standing very straight now, the way you stand when your body has decided that perfect posture might somehow save you, and he was the most frightened person on the entire post. More frightened than he had been when he was afraid of failing, because now he was not afraid of failing. He was afraid of the rest of his life. And I saw the private's shoulders from 2005. I saw the boy whose fear had run out ahead of him. I saw my own hands at my own first post, wanting the decision, and the sergeant beside me saying, "Easy, Lieutenant." And I saw my father on the porch, and the road, and the badge that only works if the person wearing it is more careful than the people they stop. I recognized the look on his face. It was the look I had spent my whole career trying to train out of young soldiers. Not malice. Panic wearing a uniform. And you do not fix panic by adding more terror to it. You never have. Every soldier I ever ruined by making an example of him, I could have saved by making a lesson of him instead. And I have watched enough men and women thrown away to know the difference in my bones. "Colonel," I said, and my voice was even, and that evenness did more to settle the scene than any order could have. "Colonel, nobody's losing anything tonight. We are going to slow this all the way down. Get the specialist a glass of water and a place to sit that is not a cell. Get his squad leader and the gate log, and get me the training records for this access control point. Nobody makes a decision about this young man until I understand why my gate produced this morning. Is that clear?" Shaw stared at me. "Ma'am," he said, "he assaulted you." And I said, "I know exactly what he did. I was there for all of it, and I am telling you that if I let you end his career in the next 12 hours to make yourself feel better about your gate, I will have learned nothing and fixed nothing, and the next scared kid is already standing a shift I have not looked at yet. So we are going to be better than our worst instinct, starting now." I got in the car with Cross driving and Naomi Marsh beside me because she had come up the road when the radio traffic started, and she had watched the last of it from 30 feet away with an expression I had seen exactly twice before. She did not say anything until we were moving. Then she said, in the flat voice she uses when she's about to tell me the truth, "You have every right to end that boy, Francis. What he did, you would be within every regulation there is." And I said, "I know." And she said, "You also taught me about 100 years ago in the Balkans that rights and rightness are not the same word. So which one are we doing today?" She was quiet for a mile of road, and then she said the other thing. The thing only she would have known to say. She said, "You know what is going to be hard about this, Franny? It is not going to be the paperwork, and it is not going to be the colonel. It is going to be that everyone above you is going to want you to be angry, because your anger would make their lives simple. An angry general they know how to handle. They write it down, they take the specialist's rank, they file the incident, everyone goes home, a general who chooses to be careful about the very thing that hurt her. That is the one that scares people, because it asks them to be careful too, and most of them do not want the assignment. She looked at me. So be ready to be lonely about it. Being right in a way nobody asked you to be is the loneliest place in the Army. She was correct, of course. She usually is. And I want to put her warning here, at the start of the hard part, because everything that came after cost more than I let on in the moment. And Naomi is the only person who saw the whole bill. That is why I keep her, because she does not tell me what to do. She holds up the sentence I said when I was young and brave and had not yet gotten tired, and she lets me decide whether I still mean it. I said, "We are doing rightness." And she nodded once and looked out the window and said, "Good," because I already knew the answer. I just wanted to see if you did. And then, quieter, she said, "Your father would be insufferable right now. He would not stop talking about it for a week." And I laughed, for the first time that morning, with grit still in my hair, because she was exactly right. That night, alone, I did the thing I have done my whole life, which is to run the argument with Colette that I have never won. "Cold," she said, in my memory, hardened, a robot, feels things in the right order. And I sat with the fact that in the morning I had let a man put his knee in my back rather than frighten him into doing something worse. And I thought, that is not the act of a cold person. That is the most careful thing I have ever done. And I realized, sitting there, that the way I handled this boy was the exact argument I had been losing to my sister for 35 years, finally made visible, finally put somewhere a person could see it. I had never been able to prove to Colette that the discipline was a kind of love. Now, maybe, I had a piece of concrete and a witness, and a young man's whole future to prove it with. The next morning, they had the machine all warmed up to destroy Wesley Pratt, and it was my job to turn the machine off. They met me in a conference room with a folder, because the folder is how the Army says goodbye to someone. Colonel Shaw was there, and the provost staff and the paperwork for the specialist separation was already drafted, clean and fast and final, the administrative equivalent of a firing squad. They stood when I came in, and I told them to sit, and I let the folder lie there on the table between us, like the loaded thing it was. I did not open it. Instead, I asked questions. I asked who had reprimanded Specialist Pratt the week before, and for what, and how it had been delivered. I asked what the manning looked like at that access control point at 0400 hours. How many soldiers, how many hours into their shift? How much sleep behind them? I asked who had trained the escalation Pratt used on me, the specific decision to take a non-compliant subject to the ground, and where in his training that lived, and what came before it in the sequence, and what he had been taught to try first. I asked one more question, the one that mattered most to me, and I asked it slowly so the room would understand it was not rhetorical. I asked what Specialist Pratt had been taught to do first. Not last. First. Before the hands, before the ground, before the shouting. What was step one? And the provost sergeant looked at his own training document and was quiet for a moment. And then he said, "Ma'am, step one is verify identification and control the subject." And I said, "Control the subject is step one. There is no step before control." And he said, "No, ma'am." And I let that sit in the room because it was the whole thing. It was the entire failure, written in 6 words. We had built a gate where the first move a frightened young soldier was trained to make was to take control, and we had never taught him that the first move is to take a breath. My father would have been sick to read it. He spent 30 years knowing that step one is always the same, in a police uniform or an army one. Step one is you make yourself calm so that your calm can travel to the other person. Everything else is step two. The answers built a picture, and the picture was not a picture of one bad young man. Staff Sergeant Dale Whitfield, the gate non-commissioned officer, had come down hard on Pratt after the earlier lapse, harder than a lapse warranted, the way a scared supervisor passes his own fear downhill. The gate was undermanned at that hour, and Pratt was near the end of a long shift. And the access control training on the post was a checklist, a literal checklist, steps 1 through whatever, with a great deal about how to physically control a subject and almost nothing at all. About how to talk to a frightened person, how to slow a moment down, how to keep your own hands from starting to think. There was no de-escalation in it. We had built a system that taught young soldiers every way to put a person on the ground and not one way to avoid it. Shaw, to his credit, was a good officer in a bad spot. and a good officer protecting his post will still reach for the fastest clean answer, which is one head on a spike. "Ma'am," he said, "I understand the systemic points and we will fix the training, but the specialist put a 3-star general on the concrete. There has to be a consequence. The command cannot be seen to tolerate that." And I said, "Colonel, I agree there has to be a consequence. I disagree about who it belongs to and how big it has to be." Then I said the thing I had come into the room to say. "If I take that young man's rank and walk out of here, I will feel just, and I will have fixed nothing. The training that made him will still be sitting on your server. The staff sergeant who leaned on him will still be leaning on the next one. And the next scared kid is already standing a shift I have not looked at yet. Ending Pratt is the cheap version. The expensive version is that I own this, publicly, all the way up my own chain, on the first week of my command, and I use it to change how every gate in this army teaches a soldier to be still. I am choosing the expensive version. It is going to cost me, I am aware, because that was the true price and I want to be honest about it. Choosing not to bury the incident meant surfacing it. It meant that in my very first days commanding every installation in the army, the story going up the flagpole would be that a specialist put me on the ground and I chose to rebuild the training instead of removing the soldier. There are people at every level who would read that as weakness, as a general who could not even hold her own gate. I knew that. I decided that a reputation I have to protect by throwing away a frightened boy is not a reputation worth protecting. My father did not spend 30 years being more careful than everyone he met so that his daughter could spend a young man's future buying herself some cover. I closed the folder and slid it back across the table, unopened, and I said, "We start with why the gate failed. Then we decide who pays, and I promise you it will be less than you want and more than you expect, because it is going to include the system and not just the symptom." Consequences did land. I want to be clear that mercy is not the absence of consequences, because that is where a lot of people misunderstand what I did, including, at first, me. Wesley Pratt was held accountable. It simply was not the annihilation everyone had reached for. I had him brought to me a few days later, and he came in expecting the end. You can see it on a young soldier, the particular stillness of a person who has decided the worst is coming and is trying to meet it with some dignity. I did not put him at ease. I did not tell him it was going to be all right, because I did not yet know if it was, and because a lie would have wasted the moment. I made him stand there, and I made him do the hardest thing, which was to describe out loud, to me, exactly what had happened inside him at the gate. I did not want his apology. An apology is cheap and fast, and it is mostly for the person giving it. I wanted him to find and name the precise instant he had stopped thinking. So I walked him back through it. "You told me to stop," I said, and I stopped. "Do you remember that?" "S'ma'am, you asked for identification, and I told you I was reaching slowly, and I reached slowly." "Do you remember?" "Yes, ma'am. So tell me." "Somewhere between my hand moving and your knee on my back, you stopped making decisions, and your fear started making them for you. I want you to find that exact second. Not so I can punish it, so you can learn to feel it coming next time, because there will be a next time in some form for the rest of your career, and I need you to survive it without putting somebody's mother on the concrete." He tried, at first, to give me the apology instead, because the apology is the easy escape hatch, and every young person reaches for it. He said, "Ma'am, I am so sorry. I should never have." And I stopped him. I said, "I did not ask you to be sorry. Sorry is for you. I asked you to find the second." He looked at me like I had taken something away from him, which I had. I had taken away the comfortable version, and then he went back inside himself and did the harder work. He said, "When you reached for the bag, that was it, when your hand moved." I had told him I was reaching slowly, and I had reached slowly, and none of it had gotten through. Because by the time my hand moved, he had already left the part of himself that could hear me. "I stopped seeing you, ma'am," he said. "I was only seeing the last time, the vehicle I let through, the reprimand, all of it, and I put it on you. You were not the threat. I was afraid of failing again, and I made you into the reason." That is as honest a sentence as I have heard a soldier say about himself, and he said it standing at attention with his voice shaking, which is the only condition under which such sentences are ever true. He found the second, and he described it, and when he was done, he was not the same soldier who had walked in. That is the difference between throwing a person away and holding them accountable. When you throw them away, the lesson leaves with them. When you hold them accountable, the lesson stays in the force. Whitfield was held to account, too, for the pressure he had rolled downhill in a way that was real and on his record, and did not end him either, because he was also a product of the same training that taught fear and called it standards. And the checklist, that terrible bloodless checklist, I had scrapped entirely. I brought Naomi Marsh in to help rebuild the access control conduct standard for the post from the ground up, because there is no one alive who understands better than she does how a young soldier's fear turns into a young soldier's hands, and how to train the gap out before it costs somebody everything. We built de-escalation into the first steps, not the footnotes. Breathe and then decide. It is amazing how long it can take an institution to write down the simplest true thing. Whitfield was harder for me than Pratt, if I am honest, and I want to say why, because it is the part of this that I am least proud of and had to work through. Pratt was a scared kid, and scared kids are easy to feel for. Whitfield was a supervisor, an experienced non-commissioned officer, a man whose whole job was to be the calm that his young soldiers borrowed until they grew their own, and instead he had taken his own fear about the earlier lapse and pushed it down onto Pratt with interest. My first instinct with him was the cold one, the one my sister believes is the only one I have. I wanted to hold him fully responsible because he was old enough to know better, and there's a satisfying justice in that. And then Naomi, who misses nothing, watched me reading his file with my jaw set, and she said, "Careful, Franny, you are about to do to him exactly what he did to Pratt. You are about to take your fear about your gait and push it down onto the nearest person who is old enough to blame." And she was right. Whitfield was also a product of the same broken training. He had never been taught to hold a lapse without turning it into a beating, because the institution had never modeled it for him either. So I held him accountable, really accountable, on his record, in a way he felt. And then I made him part of building the fix, because a man who has felt the failure in his own hands is often the best person to make sure the next supervisor never repeats it. He did not thank me for it, he did the work anyway. Sometimes that is all you can ask, and it is enough. And then I did the part that is hardest for a person like me, the part Colette would never believe I was capable of. I stepped back. I did not hover over Wesley Pratt. I did not manage his transformation like a project with milestones. I let him do the work of becoming someone who would never do that again, and I watched his trajectory the way you watch weather from a distance without the illusion that your watching is what moves it. A lesser version of me, the version my sister believes in, would have needed to control it, to be present for every step, to own the redemption the way she thinks I own everything. I let it be his. That was the discipline, not the not punishing, the not managing. He surprised me, though I tried not to let myself expect it. Within a few weeks, he was not just a retained soldier keeping his head down. He had become, quietly, an advocate among his peers for the new standard, the young man who says to a newer soldier, "No, try talking first, I will show you." There is no accountability more complete than a person who turns the worst thing they ever did into the reason they protect the next person from doing it. You cannot order that. You can only leave the door open and hope they walk through it, and he walked through it. He asked me once, in passing, why I had not ended him. I told him the truth. I told him about my father and the badge and the sentence about being more careful than the people you stop. I told him that the day he put his knee in my back, the most useful thing I owned was the ability to stay still. And that staying still was not weakness. It was the entire job, and almost nobody teaches it, because almost nobody makes you practice it. And I told him that I had chosen to make him practice it for the rest of his career instead of taking the career away. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Ma'am, I am going to spend the whole thing making sure I earned that." And I believed him, which is not something I say easily. The harder repair was the one that had nothing to do with the army. I called my sister, not to defend myself, which is the only mode Colette and I had operated in for decades, me defending, her accusing, the two of us running the same argument in slightly different words for 35 years. I called her to tell her a story about myself, which I had never once done, because telling someone a true story about yourself requires you to believe they might receive it. And I had stopped believing that about Colette somewhere around our father's funeral. I told her the whole thing, the gray morning, the walk up to the gate as a stranger, the young man wound too tight, the order to get down, I told her that I got down. I told her I let a specialist half my age put his knee in my back and hold me on the concrete, and that I did not fight him, and I did not pull my rank, and I did not raise my voice, because he was frightened and armed, and I was not going to be the second person at that gate to let fear make the call. There was a long silence on the line. And then Colette said, very quietly, in a voice I had not heard from her since we were girls, "You could have ruined him. Francis, you had every right. You could have ended his whole life, and no one would have said a word." "I know," I said, and I said the thing I had driven a long way to be able to say. Dad would have known why I didn't. The silence after that was a different kind of silence. I could hear my sister breathing, and I could hear, underneath it, 35 years starting to move. Because Colette had spent our whole lives certain that the discipline in me was the absence of feeling, the drawer where I filed my emotions in the right order and never let them out. And I had just handed her a piece of concrete and a scared young man and a choice. And the choice was not the choice of a cold person. It was the most careful thing a person can do, and careful is the opposite of cold. And she was hearing that, maybe for the first time, in a story instead of an argument. I have thought a great deal about why that story worked on her when 35 years of argument had not. And I think it is because a story does not ask the other person to concede anything. An argument is a demand. Concede that I am not cold. Concede that the army did not ruin me. Concede that you were wrong about me. Nobody concedes under demand. But a story just puts the thing in the room and lets the other person walk around it and see it from their own side. I did not tell Colette that I was careful. I told her about a morning when being careful was the only thing standing between a frightened boy and a mistake he could not undo. And I let her decide for herself what kind of person makes that choice. She arrived at careful on her own. That is the only way anybody ever arrives anywhere true about another person. I wish I had known it 40 years ago. I might have had my sister that whole time. But my father used to say there is no use grieving the harvest you did not plant, only start planting, so I planted. She did not forgive me for everything on that call. I want to be truthful. 35 years does not lift in one phone conversation, and the years I was not in the room were still years I was not in the room, and my father was still gone, and she had still been the one who stayed. Forgiveness that fast would not be worth anything. But something turned. For the first time in longer than I could remember, my sister and I were describing the same childhood in the same words. She said, "At the end, I always thought you went quiet because you did not care." And I said, "I went quiet because Dad taught me that the person in the uniform has to be the calmest one in the room, and I did not know how to be that at home and something else at work, so I was just that everywhere, and it cost me you. I am sorry it cost me you." That was as close as either of us had come, in decades, to laying a brick down instead of up. The months after did not resolve into a neat ending, because real life does not. And I have never trusted stories that tie off too clean. But the ground had moved, and you could feel it moving, the way you can feel a season change a week before the calendar admits it. I took full command of the headquarters that runs every installation in the Army, and I did the thing I said I would do. I owned the incident up my own chain, all of it, the general on the concrete and the choice not to punish, and I used it. The access control conduct standard we had built at Fort Calvert, the one with breathing built into the first step instead of the footnotes, got looked at by people who run other posts and then by people who run all of them. The thing I had chosen over revenge was quietly becoming the thing that would outlast the incident. That is the part that would have made my father put down whatever he was holding and just look at me. Not the 3 stars, the training, the idea written into the institution that the first thing you teach a soldier at a gate is how to be still. A letter came from Wesley Pratt some weeks in. It was short, and it was not groveling, which is why I kept it. He did not thank me for saving his career. He told me, plainly, like one soldier reporting to another, that he had helped write the peer version of the new standard, and that he had done it because he never wanted another person to feel the concrete the way he had made me feel it. He signed it with his rank and his name, and I put it in the drawer where I keep the few things that have meant something, next to a photograph of my father in a coat that did not quite fit. And Colette called me. That is the sentence I keep returning to because of how ordinary it sounds and how enormous it was. In all the years of our estrangement, I had always been the one to reach across, tentatively, and get met with the wall, This time the phone rang and it was my sister, calling the general, calling first, about nothing in particular, about a photograph she had found of the two of us as children, standing in front of our father's patrol car, both of us squinting into the sun. She wanted to know if I remembered the day. I did. I remembered all of it. We talked for an hour about a childhood we had spent decades remembering differently and were finally, slowly, remembering the same. I realized, somewhere in that hour, that the story I had almost turned into a punishment had become the thing that let two people see me clearly. If I had ended Wesley Pratt at that gate, I would have been just, and I would have been exactly the person Colette always believed I was, the one who feels things in the right order and never out of turn. The mercy was not for him, or it was not only for him. It was the first true thing about myself I had ever managed to show, instead of tell to the people I most needed to see it. There is a small cemetery in the town where I grew up, and on a clear afternoon a few weeks ago, Colette and I stood together in front of our father's headstone. I had not been able to do that, really do that, since the funeral I flew away from. My sister stood beside me, close enough that our shoulders were almost touching, which for us was practically an embrace. I told him, out loud, the way you are not supposed to feel foolish doing at a grave, but always do. I told my father about the gate and the gray morning and the young man wound too tight and the knee in my back. I told him I got down. I told him I stayed still, that I let my hands stay where they were, that I remembered the porch and the road and the thing about the not stopping being the whole job. I told him a scared boy was going to spend a whole good career being careful now, because I had chosen to be still on a piece of concrete instead of loud. And I told him I finally understood that the stillness he practiced for 30 years in 2 uniforms had gone all the way down into me, deeper than my sister could see, deeper than I could prove, until the morning it had a witness. Colette was crying, quietly, in the right order, and out of it both. And when I was done, she reached over and took my hand. My sister, who had spent 35 years, certain I did not have a warm one to offer. And she said the thing I had waited my whole life to hear from someone who was still alive to say it. He would have been so proud of you, Francis. And then, after a moment, in a voice that closed a wound I had carried longer than I had carried my rank, so am I. I saw Wesley Pratt one more time before I left Fort Calvert, for the last time, though he did not see me. He was at a gate in the early light, and there was a newer soldier beside him, wound a little too tight the way they all are at first. And I watched Pratt put a hand on the young soldier's forearm, not grab it, just set it there. And I could not hear the words, but I did not need to, because I know the shape of them in a person's mouth. Breathe and then decide. The lineage of it. The stillness, handed down one more time. From my father, to a porch, to a leg wound, in a country whose name does not matter, to a piece of concrete, to a frightened young man who is now teaching it to someone else. That is the only kind of immortality I have ever believed in. So let me tell you what the concrete taught me since you have come this far with me. The most powerful thing I have ever done in a uniform was stay on the ground when everything in me wanted to stand up. I had the rank to end a man with a sentence, and I used it instead to be still. Power you do not have to use is the only kind worth having. The rest is just fear wearing a badge, and I have spent my whole life trying to keep it out of the hands of frightened people, my own hands, most of all. And here is the last thing, the thing I would want you to take with you. The people who love you cannot see you while you are busy proving you are strong. They can only see you once you stop proving it and start showing them you are careful. I spent 35 years being strong at my sister, and she never saw me once. It took a young man's knee in my back and a choice not to make him pay for his fear, for her to finally look at me and recognize her own blood. Be careful with your authority. Be careful with the people you have every right to ruin. And be careful, most of all, with the ones who have known you longest, because the version of you they cannot see is usually the truest one. And the only way to show it to them is to be it, out loud on the hardest morning when no one would blame you for being something else. My father was right about everything. The badge only works if you are more careful than the people you stop. And the hardest part is never the stopping. The hardest part is the not stopping, the letting your hands stay where they are, the staying still. I stayed still. It cost me nothing I will miss, and it gave me back a sister and a father's pride and a young man's whole good life. That is not revenge. Revenge is loud and it is fast and it leaves you exactly as alone as it found you. This was the other thing. This was peace. And I would lie down on that concrete again, every single morning to feel it one more time. If you've ever had someone put you down without knowing the first thing about who you really are, I'd love to hear how you handled it in the comments. Would you have stayed down on that concrete, or would you have stood up and pulled rank? Do you think I was right to rebuild that young soldier instead of ending his career? And is there someone in your own life who has only ever seen the strong version of you and never the careful one underneath? Tell me, I read every single comment. If this story meant something to you, hit that like button and subscribe, and thank you for being here.